welcome to the show, Bobby. It's good for you to join you here in New Orleans, your new hometown.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's good to have you here. So you've had. Let's jump right into the show here. You've had this amazing, wonderful breadth of experience in the broader field of economic development, and especially when it comes to small business, community, and support systems. Tell us a little bit about your pathway and how did you meet sort of this calling?
Yeah, that's a long journey, but it really starts with a passion for architecture and urban planning. I really enjoy spaces and places and how they serve people. I took a class in grad school called location theory. I was studying abroad in Istanbul, and it was all about how retailers decide to locate. And I was like, whoa, this is a career.
And so this can't be.
Right. And so we had like IKEA and McDonald's and other JLL, which is John Lane LaSalle back in the day, but all come to the class and they're just talking about the subject. And so I utilized that to really say, hey, wow, you can actually impact something that is on the ground and impacts everyday life. And so being in Istanbul as well with cafe culture and all of that, it creates a different idea of what is business, retail business, other than big national brands that may only have the same SKUs every place, but you have these local businesses who offer a cultural experience that's very different. And so took that into my career. Worked for a broker in Cincinnati for a while. Worked at another design consulting practice, and then went to the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation, where I really saw like a lot of supports around small businesses that are storefront businesses, not just big tech, high growth, all that. So it's just like, oh, I need to go learn. And so being able to learn from, all of my colleagues that I worked with throughout the city in the role as a retail manager was really beneficial and meaningful for me. And so I started at Access, really one, because my partner, we moved here because of, she just got a job at Tulane. So we're now here, and I was like, I need some flexibility to do something really good in my career, something I want to do with my career, I guess, while also recognizing that a lot of these resources that Detroit has need to be verbalized and shared across the nation to other areas that are just like, oh, we also need small business supports that's for the retail sector, and how do we leverage community development block grants, or how do we stand up community development financial institutions in order to really support them?
Yeah, you really connect on two I think important items that need to be discussed more nationally. One is the big difference between retail that's simply transactional and retail that's experiential, and I think helps to define community. And I think the other big point that really you hit on is that underlying, whether it's like high-tech economic development or however we want to think about the broader field of economic development, if you don't have wonderful places, which often are defined by these experiential retail establishments, it's very hard to have successful economic development. Now, you've taken all of that and most recently developed, obviously, your company, which is called Access. And I love that name because I think access is such a really important word, in that underlying access is equity. Yeah. And whether if we think about equity in the form of access to markets, access to networks or mentorship or what have you, capital obviously, which is a big part of your work. And as economic development professionals like yourself, where do you see the breakdown happening as we think about bridging to access for all?
Yeah, that's a great question. One, I want to just make sure we're positioning it. We focus primarily on retail, restaurant, storefront-based businesses. So there's access that exceeds that, right? And for many communities, for many individuals and business owners. However, our focus is there, and we really, wanted to go there as a name because it is something that starts to span, right? Different topics such as knowledge and capital, resources of all types. And so, as we think about our work and who is it for? It's really for those who are historically excluded, right, and from opportunities in workforce, whether that's immigrants or returning citizens, those with lower educational attainment, and realizing that there's not a lot of economic development occurring for many of those communities that have to rely on retail, specifically like selling some food or their favorite empanadas or whatever, as a way of commerce, as a way of providing for their families. And so thinking about that, we wanted to work with municipalities to say, hey, this is an important topic, right? In 2019 when we first started, it was hard. To say like this is an important topic, we should be all paying attention to it. We went through the roller coaster of 2020 together, and recognizing that there's a big perspective shift back to small businesses, and understanding their role and value, and had a lot of resources from the federal government, et cetera, that really supported that. Recently you see a swing back, right, or not as much of a perspective there, not as many resources, but I can commend many places who are actually trying to push the narrative forward. We worked with Rhode Island Department of Commerce last year, where we were working on the comprehensive economic development strategy, and make sure I get that right. And with that, it really they focused on retail and restaurant. One, because they have different industries that they're in biotech and offshore, all of their water resources, etc. But they realized that with the University Johnson and Wales, with Providence having the most big restaurants per capita outside of San Francisco, maybe it's all just big. This is a place where this industry matters, and so trying to provide the resources in order to ensure those businesses are able to not only sustain but grow within the economy is really important.
Why do you think, that's an excellent point, in that I think it's difficult for the economic development field overall to think of retail restaurants as a form of economic development, even though they can be key drivers, whether it's in the tourism sector or just livability for where human capital wants to be. Any assumption as to why that is? Why are we so fad driven towards we need to be a biotech haven or a high tech haven?
I mean, the economic development metrics are jobs and employees, right? Or no, wages. So it's okay, well, it really focus on how are we producing more for the society at something that's quote unquote scalable, right? And so you think about high growth businesses, and when they're talking about receiving venture capital, it's because they reached a certain levels of efficiency, economies of scale that they're able to produce, right? And so that is rare within the retail sector, specifically within the small businesses, which represent majority of all retailers, and drives most of the occupancy of main streets to downtowns. Strip centers are a little bit different beast, but just thinking about how those businesses that are high growth can contribute to society, and they think and that has a larger weight, I would say, than those that are in retail, because hey, maybe you only employ one other person or two other people, instead of really being able to get to that economy of scale from a business perspective that's employing hundreds of thousands, which is more of a reasonable or expected trajectory, I would say, of some of those other industry clusters.
Yes, I think you're right. I think we look at the solo business when maybe what we should be doing is thinking about the density of those that actually add up to to one singular big business. Yeah. But you work with so many small businesses out there. I'm always interested in sort of trend lines and what's happening within the field. What are you seeing out there?
Well, I mean, I think back on the subject of this large scale businesses that are able to, grow and occupy a lot of space, have maybe franchises or hundreds of operations compared to, the small business landscape. You get into, that transactional experiential one, back to, what you were mentioning earlier, where, you have all these SKUs at, supermarket or a Walmart, etc., and you can find those same SKUs online, right? And so it diminishes the role of the store, unless it's for convenience or emergency, etc. Whereas within small business, that's a very different SKU makeup, right? And so just that is what create the experience one, and that with the built environment and how do you actually deliver those services or goods to the customer, etc. And so that's going to always, I think, underpin a trend, right? And so what's challenging that is one, e-commerce, right? And so hey, big businesses are able to adopt digital technology at a faster rate, get things automated into the customer's hand, be able to take on new regulations. One that's coming out is like Snap EBT, just being able to accept it online. And so, hey, are grocery stores, from a local base, a mom and pop, going to be able to tap into that technology easily, or is it only going to be your national branded supermarkets? And so being able to really articulate across this trend line of hey, these technologies or these innovations are impacting small businesses and their viability long term, and something that we need to pay attention to. I think also just customers, right? And so if you think about where people are, where people have been moving, really after and through the pandemic, is central business districts aren't as viable as of a retail location, with their legacy high rent rates and dependent on the office customer. Many downtowns are trying to figure out what do we do with our central business district without a residential population. Yeah. And so that's one, but also thinking about what happens outside of that CUD, right? Now people are spending more time in their neighborhoods, and that could be in larger cities. And then you can even think about people that are deciding, hey, I am remote worker, and I now don't need to be adjacent to the major city, right? So I can move to a smaller town, and I can either continue that job as well as open up a new business, right? And so that those businesses might on Main Street, they might be their office spaces that could be on Main Street as well. And so I think one of the things that I would say is an opportunity for Main Street specifically is just how do you think about what's the new makeup of the business mix or the occupancy that happens on the corridor from who's the customer most nearby? Do they need a co-working space, or do they need their own private office that could service second floor locations or clustered on one end of the main street, and we'll keep the energy of the retail sector there, but that provides customers, right, for those businesses day in and day out. And so really being able to utilize that as a strategy now that this big shift in where we are, who the customers are, and what does that mean for business opportunities.
I'm going to move into, so what you're hitting on, and I think what people don't, or they underestimate, is the pace of change, especially from a sort of a real estate perspective, and how consumerism shifts, which then changes the whole real estate sort of paradigm for commercial businesses. So obviously throughout history, we've had this evolution of downtowns to regional malls because of the Interstate Highway Act, and to suburban strip centers, and then the growth of central business districts in big cities because of the office sector and entertainment venues, the sports stadiums, and everything else. And the pandemic really shook up a lot of that, to where, to your point, we certainly saw more residential out-migration, more focus on neighborhoods, and then also remote work, or people wanting to get to outdoor recreation and more rural environments. What impact do you see that having, or potentially having, on those neighborhood commercial districts or in those small towns?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's a really big question. But I think, there's one, the growth of the rent rates that occur because of this, out migration into, with access to capital, access to the networks to like do something different within these historic districts. And so as those, as that investment occurs, new businesses open, they maybe push someone out. So displacement becomes a risk factor. But I think all of it is really an opportunity to say, hey, let's understand what's occurring. Like, let's understand who these people are that are coming in. What are their goals? How do we align goals across, different stakeholder groups, whether it's existing businesses who are tenants of the spaces they may be buying, or next door to a business they may be starting. So really being able to root that conversation into reality instead of it just being oh no, they're bad, right? So, and once you get to past that, this, oh, we actually we have mutual goals. And so like now think about, what are the externalities or the outcomes that occur based upon, now aligning those goals. So it's like, all right, how do we make sure rent rates aren't increasing too fast, or you're moving a business out that might have a lot of cultural value for a community. And then what resources after that are required in order to really support that next step for the district, for the neighborhood, for the community.
One of the I had an opportunity back in the fall to attend the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network Summit, and I know that it's an organization very close to your heart, you're quite active in supporting and contributing to the network. And I want to stay on this sort of line of what's been happening and what we're seeing happening across the country relative to real displacement occurring. As to your earlier point, you have real disruptions in migration patterns due to remote work, or just investments that are taking place in certain communities that then become really attractive to people that weren't living there and beforehand, and then there are real estate transactions and growth and success, but not always the ability and opportunities for everyone to participate, especially those individuals that were living there or owning businesses there previous. Could you talk a little bit about how you're seeing your work address some of these issues, whether it's in the policy realm or programming realm?
Yeah, so it's a widespread problem across the nation that don't necessarily have a lot of tools available. One, if you think about affordable housing, there are lots of tools, whether that is landlord-tenant rights to different funding mechanisms that can support those residents in terms of and the developers generating the affordable housing. We can talk a little bit about, we can go really deep into affordable housing challenges. However,
on the residential side.
Right, on the residential side. And then but on the commercial side, we have to figure out what those tools are.
Yeah,
right?
there's just not that many,
There's
right?
not that many, there's not a lot of buckets of funding. Right?
Yeah.
Just or institutionalized funding from federal government all the way down to your local. And so, what we've seen be successful, one is, the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network has a toolkit, right? So it grew out of some work that, done by some PhD students. We had a class at the University of Maryland where we were looking at, hey, what tools do we know already out there and how can they be applied to some communities within Montgomery County? And so, what we did, is just look at what's good, what's working, how is it working, recognizing nothing's a silver bullet answer, right? But what they are is some legacy businesses ordinances. So I think San Francisco was one of the first to start that, and they provide rent subsidy for older businesses as rates are going up. So helping to communicate programs like that to clients. Also thinking about, what does it look like to have stronger leases for small businesses? Back to this landlord-tenant rights. There's not a lot of commercial tenant protections across the nation by any state, district, or other jurisdiction. But thinking there's also a lot of businesses that only have leases, right? And so they are in these spaces. We were talking to a business in Tulsa a couple weeks ago, and they've been in the space for 16 years and they've never had a lease. Right? And just like, one wrong comment to the landlord, they might get kicked out
the next day.
The next day, it's so much risk that's associated without having those contractual documents in place. And sometimes it's cultural, sometimes it's just like, hey, I don't even know if it's worth the headache, or not even knowing what should be into a lease. And so we're working with the George Kaiser Family Foundation to really prop up model leases and terms that businesses should be thinking about. And then, thinking also about what has been driving most of the conversation is really property ownership and community ownership. Because, that's probably the best solution, right? Of if you own the space, you're able to, have a little bit more sustainability. You don't have to deal with, rising rents because your mortgage is typically locked in for, however long it is, 7, 10, 15, 30 years, depending on what type you get for the commercial entity. But recognizing that that's not always feasible for many businesses. Some organizations in that order to circumvent that is all right, well, we'll take on a master lease and then lease it out to small businesses, or we'll think about ways to provide additional subsidies to support. And that's been doing it through the work that I've been working with Sweet Auburn Works in Atlanta, where we're just all right, how do we start a Spark Lab? They occupy the space as their office. They use the storefront space as opportunities for emerging entrepreneurs, but they're able to provide it to them at little or no cost, just really because of having the space, right? And so it's if they're able to occupy and hold more leases along the corridor, like other organizations across the nation, how can you now give the space back to the business at a sustained rate that they might not have been able to sign a lease for in good trust for themselves? I can do 1 year, maybe 3, but you can't. Then you're at whatever the market is after that, right? And so you want that 10-year, that 20-year lease to really sustain that space. So I think it's really back to ownership and contractual documents, and then those funding supports that really start to answer a lot of the myriad of challenges as it relates to commercial preservation and anti-displacement.
Yeah. Given your work, I can see where obviously the retail businesses or restaurants would be bought into that, and the local community serving or small business organizations or main streets are into that. What about the property owners? How do you think they respond? How do we bring them around? Because I think here's the key point. There's sort of short-term, long-term. I think what we've seen in areas where there has been a lot of displacement, maybe in neighborhoods in New York or whatever, have a long enough period of that occurring, when those businesses, Starbucks or the national brands that can afford the rent, then go away, or the neighborhood transforms so much that it loses its identity, there's sort of a cycle back and in the long term. And I wonder, what makes those neighborhoods so wonderful is the uniqueness and the experience that those independent small businesses bring. Is that part of the argument to property owners, or are they just seeing dollar signs in the short term?
And so, we have to break up the property owner puzzle, right? They're not all ubiquitous and motivated by the same thing.
Good point.
And so there are different profiles, right? So you'll have your institutional owner that's a big corporation that owns lots of properties. They maybe can be long-term holders, or they could just be, trying to figure out where that value add and then transition ownership to another group, right? And so there are different business models associated with that type of group. There are also on the other side of the spectrum of mom and pop property owners just like, I'm solely rooted into what's best for this community. We were able to talk to a property owner in Raleigh, and they're just like, yeah, like we're always going to lease to small.
Yeah, they're like mission driven.
Yeah, mission driven. They're going to figure out how to make the lease rates work. It might be a challenge for them, but it doesn't impact their profitability because they already underwritten a lot of the properties this way. And so I think back to on the solution side of this conversation, it's really being able to understand and categorize your owners, right? And like, what are their drivers? How do we align some of our anti-displacement work or our small business like growth and cultivation work alongside with those that are like have those goals in mind? And then how do we drive profit for some of the businesses that might be like restaurants that have high revenue thresholds and potential different than say a craft store, right? And so that is with your institutional owners who might be more profit motivated. And so being able to be strategic within your like looking at a series of owners in order to get to a series of solutions.
It's wonderful, and it's great advice in that these are complex issues, and it's not going to be probably one thing, that you really have to be strategic about it and understand the marketplace, understand who your property owners are, etc. It's really important.
Yeah, so one thing we do in our project is actually mail a letter, because you only have their address typically, not their email address or phone
You
number.
heard this, like, Bobby is mailing letters.
I am mailing physical letters to
Yes.
property owners, specifically within districts that have lots of absenteeism,
Yes.
or that the property owners don't even know about what's going on or the study. They might live across the nation or world, and just like, hey, we're doing the study. If you want us to integrate your goals into this, please give us a call or fill out a survey or whatever, so that we can understand what is real and not just what's altruistic based upon like the community desires, which I don't want to diminish what those community desires are, but we have to figure out ways to realize them through the conditions and controls that we have.
One of the new aspects of your business and Access, right, is been what's called in place. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because that's a new tool or driver that you're looking at relative to this subject.
Yeah, thanks for that. We're really excited about it. It came out of my work as a cultural health leader at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is a program from their foundation. And we get funded to do a strategic initiative, and I was like, all right, what would move the needle for it, right? For my understanding personally and edification, but also for the industry. And what landed on is in place is really, really doing a lot of research around, hey, what are these conditions that are impacting businesses, and how are we moving that into a replicable impact investment fund? And so initially, we did a big survey. 629 businesses, or maybe more probably now, have completed it. We analyzed those results. We had it in many different languages, thanks to some nonprofit partners that we had across the nation. And it was really asking them everything from, what are they paying in rent? How long is their lease? Do they have a lease? What type of business they are, all the way through, like, all right, how's neighborhood changes impacting their sustainability? Some of the things that surprised me throughout this was just like this, like, half of the businesses were just like, oh, we would love to own a property. And then the other half was like, never, right? Just like, we do not want that. And I think that gives you back to this, like, all businesses aren't created the same. They all don't have the same goals. Some of them want to be a 5-year runway and then do something different. Some of them want to just sustain what's been generations of a pharmacy or something that may be passed down in their families. And so being able to really meet businesses where they are was something that we found be essential within this model development. And we landed on something which really is, hey, how do we acquire properties that are occupied by primarily minority-owned businesses within, say, gentrifying neighborhoods. And so that gentrification has many different ways of calculating, but we see that as investment that's entering into the market. And how do we hold those properties, stabilize those businesses through a lower base rent with a percentage rent on top that's based upon the business's performance, and to get the businesses higher in performance, how do you pair that with like growth opportunities and growth strategies such as technical assistance on accounting, or how do you create new verticals within the space? So now it's maybe going from a barbershop to a barbershop and a bar, or it has some chicken wings that you get to eat while you're waiting, right? And so just thinking really about like what are these ways that can really support business revenue growth while sustaining them within their space and for their communities. And so really, ideally at the end, it's just like realizing the returns based upon those growth that's occurring. But if the growth does not occur, it's also stabilized because they have a base rent that's attainable, right? And a base rent that they can continue to rely on, similar to a mortgage, in perpetuity.
Yeah.
And hopefully at the end of all of this work, as we launch the fund, within the next year, it's just really thinking about, hey, we can now transfer this ownership over too. It's just like, as these businesses who historically couldn't access that capital, right? Like who can't be approved for a loan for that commercial mortgage initially, but now they have this stabilized lease that have financials associated, have a growth plan in place that banks see them as a much more viable contender once it comes to that property ownership. And so that's how we're thinking about it.
Yeah.
It's a work in progress. You continue following our website to like learn more as we're sharing more out. But it's something that's just like, okay, well, we have the tools and the ingredients, right? And back to those solutions that I was talking about in terms of policies and programs, it's like ownership matters. Technical assistance matters. Access to that capital matters in order to yield a lot of these businesses' growth plans if they have any, or if they want to just sustain themselves.
Well, first, we applaud you in
Thank you.
making this effort because, to our earlier discussion, there just simply are not enough tools, again, whether they're policies out there or programs, and being able to do it at scale. And so what you're doing is that hard R&D that it takes to develop something than many other organizations and efforts can really take a hold of and adopt to their own communities. So we will have the website and in place drawn out in the podcast notes, so make sure you do take a look at Bobby's website. I want to just conclude with something that, and your question is slightly different, and so I'm gonna add a little bit here. That typically we ask our interviewees around advice they would give to other small businesses, and obviously you're a small business, but I also love the fact that you've spent so much time in sort of the economic and place-based work. And I'm wondering if we could focus, what kind of advice would you give to other place professionals out there that are experiencing challenges, with displacement, or many communities that are on the cusp and concerned about what they're seeing from a trend line perspective?
Yes. That's you throw me a wild card. So I'm just like, but one of the things that I recognize within my work in places and with place professionals is there's a need to intimately know what's happening, right? Know the property owners, know the business owners, know the what's happening from a policy landscape, what tools that can be leveraged, because without that initial access to knowledge, right? It's just like you can't get those equitable outcomes that you are striving for. And so take your time to do that homework. And that might, again, it's that R&D period before you can say, hey, this is the solution we need to go after, which is difficult for many organizations that are staff limited. So it's like, as you're bringing on new staff, what does that training process look like? That ensuring that they understand the breadth of the challenges. Yes, we love on-the-job training, but there's also need for maybe some curriculum associated with that that's unique and bespoke to your community. And so, as what I'd say is just like it matters that you are a voice and you can represent what the challenges that are coming to the community, are already present in the community, and as you're able to represent them, you have to continue to challenge like what your perspective is and your altruistic goals and your drivers, right? Walkability is great, but you also need a parking lot in most places, right? So it's just like, so you have to like be able to say, all right, yes, we might still need to like keep some parking here. We know we love everybody to bike here, but it's cold. And so all of the realities that we are faced with, and do it in a way that's not like serving your own personality and your ego, even if that is a driver for you, but is mostly rooted in the outcomes for the neighborhood and the community that they serve.
So simply put, it's not about you, it's about the community.
Very, very true. Yes.
Bobby, thanks so much for joining the podcast. It was great. Really appreciate all the insight and certainly advice as well, even with my curveball. And we'll look forward to watching all of your future endeavors and following in place and joining with you in making sure that that's a wonderful success.
All right. Thank you for having me.